quoting himself to himself, I told Trump, I don't do sneaky things. I don't leak. I don't do weasel moves. And then he leaked that document to a reporter. So that's who we're dealing with here.
Welcome to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM for Friday, May 16th. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm joined by RCP co-founder and president Tom Bevan and Washington bureau chief Carl Cannon. So, gentlemen, we have to start with one of the stranger stories for the week. It involves James Comey, who sent out an Instagram post on Thursday. It was a picture of a formation of seashells on a beach that spell out 8647. 86 is slang for getting rid of something or killing someone, depending on who you ask. Donald Trump is the 47th president of the United States, and this has set off quite a firestorm. Here's Trump reacting to it in an interview that's going to air on Bret Baier's show tonight, I believe.
A child knows what that meant. If you're the FBI director and you don't know what that meant assassination. And it says it loud and clear. Now, he wasn't very competent, but he was competent enough to know what that meant. And he did it for a reason, and he was hit so hard.
So, Tom, Comey's taking the post down. He says, quote, I didn't realize some folks associate those numbers with violence. It never occurred to me, but I oppose violence of any kind. So I took the post down. How seriously should the rest of us be taking this story?
Well, I don't know that he didn't know that that wasn't associated with violence. It's been used in that context occasionally. And certainly when it comes to Donald Trump, who's been tried to kill, they've tried to kill him twice already. You have to perhaps be a little bit more sensitive. Look, this is ridiculousness on the part of James Comey. I mean, either he was just wandering along the beach and he saw these shells. He's like, oh, that's interesting. I'll take a picture of that. Or he actually placed the shells there himself, which is a possibility, which would be even more ridiculous. He's got a book coming out. I can only assume he wanted to re-inject himself into the conversation. Any publicity is good publicity, I suppose. But look, James Comey he's a guy who has turned out to be, in my opinion, sort of a bad actor when it comes to Donald Trump and the FBI under James Comey. And I'm sure Democrats would say they've got their problems with James Comey too because of the way he handled Hillary Clinton's emails and all that. But he's just turned out to be way more political than anyone ever thought that he was or that he should be. And we always thought that our directors of the FBI were supposed to be, more down the line in the middle. And James Comey has turned out to be a rabid anti-Trumper, and he's at it again.
Well, Carl, he did say that he found these stones. I don't know. I've done a lot of beach walking in my time, and I've never come across anything quite like this. But maybe he's spending more time on the beach than I am. And other people say, look, 86, that just means to get rid of. It's a restaurant term that people use, like 86. That if you're out of string beans, you 86 is string beans. But you're a student of language. What do you think?
It was coined in the 30s by soda jerks. And that doesn't mean those people were jerks. That's another archaic phrase. And it meant that you were, what you said, Andy, you were out of a product, 86 on the Coke, 86 on the cherry Coke. We don't have it is what it means. But by the 1990s, it was used in argot and, detective novels. And by the way, James Comey is not only a former FBI director, he's like a crime novelist now. That's his latest thing. And it's an argot that means, to get rid of somebody. And gangsters started using it in the 30s to mean you kill somebody. I don't know whether, I would assume Comey knew what it meant. And I guess based on his own track record of dissembling, I would assume he arranged the seashells himself. Yeah, that's just actually my working assumption. This is a guy who went in to visit Trump while he was trying to wheedle his way into staying as FBI director after Trump had been elected. And remember, and as you pointed out, or was it Tom? At the time, liberals blamed Comey for Trump being elected because of his missteps on the Hillary Clinton emails thing, grandiose things. And grandiosity is part of his thing too. When George W. Bush was president, he and Robert Mueller, does that name sound familiar to you guys? They went to, the hospital room and demanded Bush rescind an order, 9/11 or order relating to 9/11 about warrantless searches, which seems quaint today. But I digress. And Comey says to the White House Chief of Staff, "Here I stand, I can do no other." This is Martin Luther's famous formulation before the king. This is how this guy views himself. Anyway, so when he's talking to Trump, he's taking these notes, or rather, he rushes down to his car outside the White House and transcribed these notes. I can't remember, either longhand or computer. And one of the things he says, quoting himself to himself, "I told Trump, I don't do sneaky things. I don't leak. I don't do weasel moves." And then he leaked that document to a reporter and later admitted under oath and testimony, hoping to get a special counsel appointed. The special counsel appointed was Robert Mueller. So this guy, oh, and by the way, he and Mueller, the biggest case they ever handled in their life was the anthrax case. And both of them focused and framed basically an innocent man. So that's who we're dealing with here. And you'd think people would get used to this by now with Jim Comey. And
don't forget the setup of Mike Flynn too. He sent those agents over there. Remember, he talked about that. He said, "Oh, I thought I could get away with it because the Trump White House was so chaotic. So I just sent him over there to interview the guy." And
I mean, look, his word is weasel. That's his word. And and it seems appropriate. It's a nice self-own.
So, Tom, Tulsi Gabbard said that she thinks you should go to jail for this.
Without trial or charges.
Yeah.
Well, we could send him to El Salvador. There's a prison down there.
Wait. Let's be serious about this.
Okay.
What he deserves, I know, but what he deserves is ridicule. We don't want to suspend the writ of habeas corpus over this one clown.
I agree with that. But it is, I mean, I know a lot of people would love to see James Comey because of the way he talked about, the J6ers, and he's always this holier than thou, lecturing everybody about inciting violence and doing this and that. And here he is, according to him, mistakenly or unknowingly inciting violence or potentially inciting violence. And it's just like oops, So I understand the desire to throw James Comey in jail and perp walk him and throw away the key. But I agree with Carl. I don't think that's what we should be doing here. He should be roundly ridiculed, as he is being, including right now on this show. And I'm sure he'll go on to sell plenty of books, and he'll still be on MSNBC, and he'll still have a good life, even though this was another low point for him.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be watching The Beach more carefully because I didn't know this was a thing to do political statements by arranging seashells on the beach. It's kind of a protest, I can get behind. It's
well, if anybody is on
break
X,
up the Dodgers.
Yeah. If anybody is on X, just go and search shell formations and you'll see a bunch of funny memes about Jim Comey and the shell formations.
Yeah, it's started already.
Memes that we do not associate ourselves with. I want to quickly point that out.
Carl, as long as we're talking about the FBI, the other news is that the director, Kash Patel of the FBI, says the agency will be pulling 1,500 agents leaving the Hoover building in downtown D.C. He's going to send these agents to field offices around the country. And Carl, he may have even gone further because he did tell Fox News this FBI is leaving the Hoover building because this building is unsafe for our workforce. So you've been kind of a fan of torching the FBI building,
Carl's
right?
dream come true.
Yeah.
The building, it's the ugliest building in Washington, named after a person who had an ugly side to him.
It's the Hoover building, correct?
J. Edgar Hoover, who blackmailed presidents and did, tried to extort Martin Luther King. And, he sort of epitomizes the worst about this agency. The FBI has been politicized since its inception. They've switched targets. They used to go after liberals. Now they go after conservatives. But Kash Patel is onto something here. And he said, we got to get back to crime fighting. and he's going to send these 1,500 agents around. Now, a lot of those agents are, they're good people. They want to do good work. And what he's saying is they can do better work out not in the politicized environment in Washington. As far as that building, it's all but been condemned. The building, not for aesthetic reasons, but it needs to be retrofitted. Everybody wants, it's going to come down at some point. And the question is the new building going to go up in its place? Or is there going to be, in the suburbs? And there was a move it to Maryland, as you know, Andy. It was turned out to be kind of a suspect, corrupt,
doesn't sound like Maryland at all. Yeah,
land deal, right? so they're back to the drawing board on that. But eventually they'll be out of that building, and the building, my guess, it'll be renamed and rebuilt. And what Kash Patel is saying is, and repurposed toward a less partisan, less politicized, and more crime-fighting mission.
Well, Tom, you're in Chicago, but downtown DC. This building it's sort of halfway. It's on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's about halfway between, or it's on the road between the Capitol and the White House. And there are big nets over it because chunks of it tend to fall down from time to time. So in order to save pedestrians from concrete, they do have nets over it. It is, as Carl said, it is so ugly. It's one of these brutalist, horrible things.
Luckily, we have a developer in the White House. Just wait till Trump gets to redesign the FBI building. It'll be 50 stories tall and gold.
Yeah, he's talked about what could be done with that block. So we'll see. But Tom, I take it you are for moving at the FBI as much as possible out of DC.
Sure. I mean, look, Kash Patel made a great common sense point. He said, look, we've got a third of the FBI agents here in DC, and, but DC doesn't account for a third of the crime around the country. So we're going to send these agents out to various district offices and plus them up. And he said, reinvigorate these district offices and hopefully sort of boost morale and esteem in the local communities and try and get people, wanting to go work for the FBI and fight the bad guys. So,
Tom, I get that, but the FBI is not supposed to fight street crime. That's a state and local function. So a lot of the reason these people are here is they're doing complicated cases, like the putting together the 9/11 attacks and a lot of things. They have to interface with the Justice Department. It certainly makes sense for the headquarters of the FBI to be here, and we don't want to overstate the case that they're not supposed to stop armed robberies. I mean, that's not what that agency's for.
But I think
and I wasn't saying that we shouldn't have a headquarters, and it can be in DC, it can be in Virginia, it could be in Maryland. I don't care. I mean, it certainly probably needs to have something in the Capitol with a decent number of FBI agents there. But I think the point that he's making is a common sense one, and one that we make about and talk about a lot of different agencies, that there is too much bureaucracy fixated in DC, and a lot of these agencies, agriculture and interior, should maybe be moved out of DC. I'm not saying FBI should be one of those, but certainly just, putting some agents back in some of these district offices sounds like a good idea to me.
Yeah. Well, guys, we're going to have to take a break. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. Don't go away. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. I'm here with Tom and Carl. And Carl, Representative Summer Lee of Pennsylvania reintroduced a resolution on Thursday to give reparations to descendants of American slaves. This was a bill first introduced by Cori Bush of Missouri, who lost her seat back in 2024. It would cost about $14 trillion that would go towards reparations. That's the estimate. Probably not going anywhere in this Congress, Carl, but what do you make of the bill? And is this a good political look for the Democrats right now?
I covered the reparations bill against Japanese Americans, wrote about it extensively. And this was in the 1980s. I was a young reporter in my 20s, and Norm Mineta, who was a congressman I knew well, pushed it. I covered it. It was a very tailored bill, and it was aimed at the people who were incarcerated by their government during World War II. With no charges against them, the Nisei and Issei, the Japanese Americans and their descendants, who were locked up, rounded up, 120,000 of them, put in these concentration camps. Out of those camps, they volunteered formed the famed 442nd Regiment Army, won more medals, took more casualties than any Army unit. These were loyal Americans treated like foreigners, like they had done something wrong. But there was a consensus then in Capitol Hill in both parties that if there was going to be reparations, and Ronald Reagan signed it proudly, and it took effect, and these people were paid. It had to affect the people who were themselves incarcerated, not their kids, them. And did it make up for it? No, it's $20,000. A lot of these people lost their businesses, lost their farms. It was a sign. It was a symbol. This doesn't seem to be that. This seems to be more a scheme for wealth redistribution. And then the question becomes, well, then what's affirmative action? We've had that now in place for 40 or 50 years. Wasn't that a form of reparations? What about Head Start? What about these social programs that African Americans are disproportionately represented? And when you get into who's owed what, if you're talking about slavery, everybody who fought for and against slavery is long dead. And 200,000 or 300,000 white men in this country gave their lives to end slavery. Their families for generations were harmed by that. A rural economy, and hundreds of thousands wounded without legs or arms, went back, couldn't work the rest of their lives. You start to add up historical generational things, then you have to have both sides of a ledger. So I think it's problematic for the reasons I just said. I understand the impulse, and maybe something should be done. But this, to me, creates more problems than it solves.
But Tom, what about the politics of it? That's what I'm interested in. I mean, Carl, that was great.
Not the merits? Sorry.
No, I'm interested in the merits, but I'm interested in the politics, really. What do you think?
I think the politics of this are terrible for Democrats. I mean, because I agree with Carl. I mean, first of all, it's unworkable, number one. Number two, it would create more division in the country than any sort of healing that might take place. I mean, you think about, because you'd have people who had nothing to do with slavery, who are, feel like their tax dollars they're paying, to give money to people who, their families may or may not have been held as slaves. I mean, it's unworkable.
A majority of the people in the country are descendant from people who didn't even live here in 1865.
Right. So it would create massive division. And I just think the focus on race, particularly in that, progressive context, which is, who's the oppressor and who's been oppressed, and we've got to fix that, is something that they continue to push. But I think a lot of Americans are, this is all part of the DEI woke stuff that has just, the pendulum's been swinging back in the other direction. And certainly with this administration, I think a lot of people rejected that and wanted to see that go away because it was so divisive. It was reverse racial discrimination in some cases. And so I don't think it's on its merits, it's a good proposal. And I don't think, as a political matter, it's a good deal for the Democrats. I think they're going to regret it if they try and continue to make this a centerpiece or a focus of their agenda.
It does show, though, that the squad might have a little life left in them. And Cory Booker was sponsored this thing in the Senate. I was interested by this. Who wasn't at the event and is not a co-sponsor of the bill, and there's about 14 co-sponsors, AOC. So I don't know where she is on this, or whether she's reading tea leaves differently than her squad members. But I thought it was interesting that she seemed to be sitting this one out. Carl, any significance to that in your view?
Well, look, it's a progressive catechism. You won't be able to sit it out. You may not want to support this bill, but any progressive in this country is going to have to line up in favor of this concept. And that's, to Tom's point, it's a polarizing issue almost by definition.
All right. Well, guys, once again, it's Friday. That means one thing on this show.
You can't be serious, man. You cannot be serious.
It is time, Tom, for You Cannot Be Serious for Friday.
Well, first of all, I have to do a better job of bookmarking a story, because I saw something at the beginning of the week and I'm like, this is great. And I totally forgot about it. I can't remember what it was now. So
Come on, it's a target-rich environment.
Well, that's true. It didn't take me long to find a replacement, but I'm going to have to come up with a system that allows me to take full advantage of You Cannot Be Serious. My nominee this week goes to Sri Tanadar, who's the Democrat congressman from the 13th district in Michigan, who wants to impeach Trump for the third time. He filed these impeachment articles, this resolution a couple of weeks ago. And Charlie LaDuff, who, if you don't know, you write for the Detroit News. He's sort of this interesting character journalist, caught up with him and interviewed him, sort of a man on the street interview, and asked him what the 5 Grosse Pointe cities are. Grosse Pointe is part of his district, and he could not answer. And it was
one of them.
Not a single one. He said, I'm not. He was answering questions. He was answering all his questions. And Charlie Duff said, well, what are the 5 Grosse Pointe cities in your district? And he said, I'm not here to take a quiz. And then so it was a rather embarrassing moment. He, as Charlie Duff said, he impeached himself. So you cannot be serious, Congressman Tanner.
Carl, what do you got?
Mine was a headline in the New York Times that said maternal instinct is a myth that men created. And I looked at that and I thought, well, we men should get more credit then, because we taught this to elephants, dolphins, orangutans, pigs, grizzly bears, and octopus, or is it octopi? Anyway, it's a myth that the animal kingdom has embraced for reasons that I don't know. So, New York Times, you cannot be serious.
Right. Well, my You Can't Be Serious is our former First Lady and first Senator and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who weighed in on Trump's decision to accept this plane from the Qatari royal family. And this is what she said. She said, no one gives someone a $400 million jet for free without expecting anything in return. Be serious. And, I just feel like she should know. Clinton Foundation took $1 million from Qatar to mark Bill Clinton's 65th birthday. That was back in 2011 when she was Secretary of State. Some counts say that the foundation is taking about $40 million from Gulf states over the years. So half a plane. So maybe for half a plane, you don't get as much as you get for a full plane. But Hillary Clinton, maybe you should have sat this one out. You can't be serious. So that's our You Can't Be Serious for today. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. Don't go away. We'll be back with more right after these words.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief, Real Clear Politics, talking now with one of my favorite people in the world, Jason Steinhauer, best-selling author and public historian, and a person who looks at the facts and is not partisan, so we get along. Jason, welcome to the show.
Great to see you, Carl. Thank you for having me.
I want to talk to you about what's been going on at the Library of Congress this week. It's not gotten a lot of press, little coverage, but there's been so much going on. The president took this monumental, foreign trip, and we've talked a lot about that. And there were other things going on in Jake Tapper's book and everything. But the president fired earlier the national archivist, Colleen Shogan, who had taken steps she thought to insulate herself from that, but that didn't help. And now the president is tried to remove, I don't know, but he's told Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, that she's no longer in charge. And the president appoints the head of the Library of Congress, but with congressional approval, the deputy hasn't necessarily, accepted who Trump wants to serve with. So let's just start at the beginning. Fill in our readers what happened, and then I'm going to ask you why, and then I'm going to ask you why it's not if there's a problem with it. So tell our listeners and viewers what the president did exactly to Carla Hayden.
Okay, so first of all, let me just state that I formerly worked at the U.S. Library of Congress for 7 years. It was one of the great honors of my life. It's an amazing institution. I do not currently work there, and I don't speak on behalf of the library, so just for clarification purposes, I hope that I can just illuminate for your viewers and listeners sort of what's going on, why the Library of Congress is important, and what it means for the American people. So let me try to do all that. So this week, or maybe it was late last week already. Yeah. Time is a flat circle these days. The President of the United States dismissed the current Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden. He also then subsequently dismissed the Registrar of Copyrights. Now, the Registrar of Copyright oversees the Copyright Office. The Copyright Office is inside the Library of Congress. A lot of Americans don't know that. Okay, so let's take a step back then. Library of Congress has been around since 1800. It is literally the Library of Congress. It was
the Library of Thomas Jefferson, right?
Part of it was, yes. The Library of Congress itself actually predates Thomas Jefferson. There was a fire, and then Thomas Jefferson's books helped to reconstitute the library. But the library is actually part of the legislative branch, right? We have three co-equal branches of government. And so President Trump, as president, obviously he's president of the entire country, but he oversees the executive branch. Congress oversees the legislative branch. So the Librarian of Congress is actually nominated by the president, but confirmed by the Senate. So the Librarian of Congress, once confirmed, works for Congress. And what that means on a day-to-day basis is Jefferson had said at one point that there is no subject upon which members of Congress may not need to refer, or something along those lines. So basically, the Library of Congress on a daily basis is giving information to Congress.
That's why it surprised me that the president, interfered. The archives is clearly in the executive branch. That's why this surprised me. Did it surprise you?
Yeah, so that's, I think, the distinction that's kind of important for viewers and listeners to remember, right? President has direct authority over the executive branch. His direct authority over the legislative branch is not something that's necessarily enshrined in the Constitution. Now, this is a presidential appointment, the Librarian of Congress. So it seems like there is authority to remove that person at the will of the president. But to appoint a new Librarian of Congress, that requires a nomination, which then has to go through Congress. So to just appoint an acting Librarian of Congress is a little bit questionable, and that's something that's being looked into in Congress. And then to install deputies into the Library of Congress, which again, legislative branch agency, not executive branch agency, right? To do that without Congress's approval or without going through Congress is also problematic. So this is now where there's controversy both inside the library and on Capitol Hill, because as you mentioned, when the deputies who were allegedly appointed by the president arrived at the Library of Congress, they were met by Library of Congress staff and told, actually, you do not have the authority to take these positions. These positions are authorized by Congress or by us inside the library, so you need to leave. And Congress has then gone back and looked at its rules, both in the House and the Senate, to determine what is actually the case here and who is actually supposed to be running the library at this point. According to the Library of Congress itself, right now, the acting head of the library is a deputy librarian, Robert Newland, who has been there for 40 years. He came from the Congressional Research Service. He's very well respected on Capitol Hill and at the library. And so from my vantage point—
And considered nonpartisan.
Yes, very nonpartisan. Right. So from my vantage point, I think from the library's vantage point, probably even from Congress's vantage point, if they're not saying so publicly, the Deputy Librarian of Congress, Robert Newland, is in charge of the organization at the moment.
All right, let me ask you a couple of questions. One of them you may not know. I certainly don't know. What did the president have against Carla Hayden? This came out of nowhere as far as I was concerned, but you may know more about it.
Well, yeah, I'm not privy to Trump's inner circle, so I don't have any inside information to share. I will say that there was an article that was published in the Daily Mail. Gosh, I don't remember off the top of my head now, but it quoted a conservative think tank that in the quotation and in their findings, they were displeased with the Librarian of Congress and the office and the Registrar of Copyrights for some of their activities. And so there is some suggestion that maybe that was a trigger for this presidential action, that there were parties who were close to the White House who expressed concerns about their political leanings or their activities associated with DEI or progressive politics. And that necessitated or precipitated these actions. But you alluded to earlier that the president also dismissed the head of the National Archives. He's also issued an executive order that targeted the Smithsonian. So
and took over the Kennedy Center,
took over
made
the Kennedy
himself
Center.
the chairman of the board.
Right. And he's also dismissed people from the Holocaust Museum Council. That was in the news recently as well. So I think we could also see this as part of a broader trend of the White House and the movement that it represents trying to exert more control over America's cultural institutions.
You're listening to Jason Steinhauer, public historian, best-selling author. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, Real Clear Politics. You're listening to RCP on Sirius XM radio or watching on our podcast. All right, Jason, let me ask you. So, I'm not naive. The MAGA movement and President Trump himself and J.D. Vance have made it clear that they think that some of these cultural institutions that we've been talking about have gone woke. That's their word. We all know what it means. There's some evidence for that. It's not something they invented out of whole cloth. But I wonder when you start inserting yourself into these. What does Donald Trump know about the Kennedy Center? He doesn't even attend the theater. I'm wondering what's the downside here. Okay, he won the election. There's a corrective. He won on these issues, but he didn't say He didn't. I covered that campaign. He never said I'm going to take over the Kennedy Center. He never said I'm going to replace the National Archivist, who by the way had done met with Melania and done things that she thought would help her, and he certainly never said I'm going to inject myself into the Library of Congress. But it's called the Library of Congress, as you point out. This struck me as a power grab apart from the things we're talking about, the influence to desire culture, but that it's encroaching on the other branch of government. And he's got these fights with the courts. Does Trump think the presidency's been too weak? Is he trying to expand executive power? Is there a bigger issue here we ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, great questions. Again, I'm not privy to the inner circle of the White House, so I can't say with certainty what the president may or may not be thinking. I'll just read it from where I sit. I think we, in particular, I'm a public historian. I worked at the Library of Congress. I know the people that we've talked about, Colleen Shogan and Carla Hayden. I've worked with them before. And I think what Americans should and listeners should realize is that, these functions largely, overwhelmingly, regardless of whether there may be elements of quote unquote wokeism inside these institutions that may have crept in over the years, they almost always operate on a bipartisan/nonpartisan basis with the best intentions of delivering for the American people and the American taxpayer. The Library of Congress, in addition to serving the needs of Congress every single day, serves the needs of the American people every day. When we think about our nation's history, we think about the diversity and the panoply of stories that represent us as a people, those stories live inside the Library of Congress. They live inside the National Archives. The Library of Congress has collections in 470 different languages. It has 100,000 stories of America's war veterans who served from World War I through the current conflicts. It has the largest baseball card collection, the largest comic book collection, American music, American courtroom drawings. It's really an amazing institution. So I think from where I sit, I believe very strongly that these institutions must remain nonpartisan/bipartisan, that they serve all Americans, regardless if you're the wokest of the woke or you're the MAGA of the MAGA or anything in between. You are welcome at the Library of Congress, and you are welcome at the National Archives. You're welcome at the Kennedy Center, and you're welcome at the Smithsonian. There's something there for everyone. And I would encourage all of our political leaders and all of our citizens across the country to just hold on to that value, because I think there's something really magical about that. And we have so few institutions left that make that promise, that regardless of your political orientation or your background, you are welcome here and you will find something that speaks to you. Those are things we should treasure and protect. And it would be really sad to think that would be something that any administration or any movement would want to destroy. So I hope that that's not what's happening.
Well, that's a hopeful note. We're going to end on it. You've been listening to Jason Steinhauer, public historian. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, Real Clear Politics. You've been listening to RCP on Sirius XM radio. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this.
Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth, and for our next segment, we've invited RCP contributor Maggie Miller to share her latest interview for Real Clear Investigations. She talks with RCI reporter John Murawski about two rising academic institutions in Austin, Texas, the University of Austin and the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas. Both are part of a growing national movement challenging the direction of higher education, and both have been compared to Hillsdale College, the independent liberal arts college in Hillsdale, Michigan. Here's Maggie Miller in conversation with John Murawski.
John, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
So, given that schools like Hillsdale are already accredited and promote similar values, why do you think that initiatives like UATX and the SCL are still generating such strong reactions?
Well, I would say Hillsdale is a conservative island, almost like a cocoon, and it lives in its own world. And it's not really attracting the kinds of students normally. It's not competing for the kinds of students who would normally go. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's not really competing for the same professors and the same students that these other programs are encroaching on. So the UATX, which is the University of Austin, a small private college, which is a startup, and UT Austin School of Civic Leadership, which is also a startup. They're in their first year of classes. They're finishing up their second semester. They are hiring from universities. They're hiring from graduate schools, and they're drawing students from the regular pool of students. And their motto is, we're going to compete with you for students, and we're going to be more attractive, more compelling, more interesting, and more relevant. So their premise is that what's being taught at universities, what passes for the humanities, for poli-sci, or for social science, is deficient in some way. And it's really actually deficient in three ways. One is leftist or woke indoctrination or ideology. The other problem is at universities is the problem of careerism, or what they call jobism, that you're being very narrowly trained for a specific job, which is like a professional school. And the other problem, or the other challenge for the mainstream universities, is that professors are incentivized to hyper specialize in very arcane topics. So these civics programs are not just anti-woke programs, but they're also anti-careerist and anti-jobism programs. So they're classical liberal arts, right? You might get this at the University of Chicago, for example. You could also get something like it at other universities, but it's not so concentrated. And the professors aren't hyper specializing in arcane topics. So, for example, the University of Austin, they're encouraged to be public intellectual. Professors are encouraged to be public intellectuals and have podcasts, write on Substack, and essentially engage in journalism as much as they engage in scholarship. So this is a much more full frontal attack on what the academy has become, a kind of sclerotized, bureaucratized, bloated behemoth. And these startups they profess to be quick, nimble, responsive, exciting, vibrant. So that's really why they're different from Hillsdale. Hillsdale is kind of a training corps for conservative judges, conservative government officials, and just conservatives in general. These civics programs aren't really training grounds for conservatives. They want to draw in the liberals. They want to attract everybody.
I mean, you just mentioned that the organizers of these universities, colleges, they mention that fostering conservative thought in dialogue with liberal thought is their goal. So from your reporting, do you think that these programs are succeeding in creating that kind of intellectual exchange?
Yeah, so that comment about what you just said, like fostering conservative thought within the broader academy, that was the impression of a professor, I believe, who sat on a committee that hired the dean for the UT Austin's School of Civic Leadership. That dean, by the way, has described himself as being straight out of an evangelical, straight out of central casting, who believes in the American exceptionalism. So he is the true conservative. Yes, they do interact because they have, for example, first of all, they draw students. Any kind of student can take these classes. You can major in it, or you can just take a class. And the classes are interesting, and they have interesting topics. So lots of students will be drawn to these classes, and lots of students are looking for something other than being told that the United States is essentially a site of human rights abuses, and Eurocentrism and Western European expansion is the worst thing that ever happened in the history of the human race. So they're looking for something, a different perspective or some kind of alternative to what is very common in academia. I'm not sure it's common in every class, but it's common enough that if you go to academia and study the humanities and social sciences, you're going to encounter this view. So, and it's difficult to challenge that kind of hostile or a prosecutorial view towards the Western civilization. It's difficult to challenge it with, I think forcefully, without meeting some resistance from the academy. I mean, the fashionable thing to do is to be anti-American and anti-West, and to some degree anti-male and anti-white, and anti-Christian and anti-straight. I know it's a cliche, but that's not, it's not not too much of an exaggeration. So the other question would then be, are they really engaged? The other thing that they do is they bring in speakers. They have speaker series, which kind of function like debates. And so they're bringing in speakers, and they do bring in, they had one of these schools, for example, they do bring in really liberal speakers to talk with conservatives. So, for example, one of these schools, forgot which one it was, brought in Cornel West of Harvard, who is a Black professor at Harvard. I think he taught a rap class on rap. But he's also a person who's very much committed to this classical liberal tradition, even though he is has a kind of Afrocentric aspect to his teaching or to his lecturing. He's still very much anchored in the Western tradition. And one of his favorites, one of his favorite writers is Chekhov. So we're talking about Cornel West. One of his favorite writers is Chekhov. So it's not like, if you were to listen to Ibram X. Kendi, all his favorite writers, musicians, and artists would all be people with a brown complexion, right? So it's all based on identity. Whereas for the classical liberals, it's sort of based on the content of the literature, not necessarily the identity of the speaker. Does that make sense?
It does. So reading classical texts and engaging deeply with foundational ideas sounds like a strong academic model. Some might say that, they're trying to shift the pendulum back from where they think higher education has progressed to over time. What do you see are the greatest strengths and the possible limitations to this approach?
I would say that the greatest strengths of it is that it's worked for hundreds of years. So it's a time-tested approach, and it's been road tested and field tested at hundreds of universities, and it generally has worked. Now, where it began falling apart is with the rise of the Frankfurt School in the 20s in Germany and the rise of the New Left in the 60s, with a very forceful critique of the West. And basically after World War I and after World War II and after the Holocaust, the entire West experienced a massive crisis of confidence, essentially a loss of confidence, in that it started believing the narrative that it was nothing but a colossal lie, that had been nothing, that it was largely a project of exploitation, domination that resulted in Nazi Germany, in colonization and the extermination of entire populations and gulags and concentration camps. And so this massive crisis of confidence is what the Western tradition has not actually met. It has not actually confronted it in a way that has been intellectually satisfying to universally. So this is why creates this void for the critics to come in as critics of Western civilization, and they basically claim that they stand outside of the West. They're no longer part of the West, and they're allied with Palestine and people of color and people of oppression. So they're standing outside of those who have created the civilization. So I think the big challenge is, can these programs do something more than just revive education as it existed in 1955? Because in a sense, if you went to Hillsdale, you would get the kind of classical liberal education you might get in 1955. But what do you do with all this knowledge that has accumulated since then, over 75 years? And this would be the deconstructionists and the postmodernists and the post-structuralists and the critical theorists and the radical feminists and the queer theorists and the transhumanists and all these strains of knowledge that have just proliferated. that don't accept the basic foundations of Western civilization, which is reason, logic, empiricism. And so how do you incorporate all that? How do you deal with all that? How do you make that part? Is that part of the Western tradition? And if it is, how do you incorporate it? And if it's not, if it's just something else, what is the Western tradition since 1955, other than a reaction against it? So I think, but that's an intellectual problem for intellectuals and writers. I think for the students, the undergraduates are getting it's still a general overview. So for them, it's not such a big problem. They can still learn, even if they're not reading what's been written in the last 50 years, they're reading so much. They have very heavy reading loads in these classes, and it's very heavy on debate. It's a Socratic method of debate, small classes debate. It's not large. It's not a large lecture series. It's not a lecture presentation. So for the students, it's much less of an issue unless you're a student that's come from a private university or a very progressive high school, a private high school or a very progressive high school where you're introduced to critical theories and social justice activism. Because what we mean by critical theories is social justice activism. And then you feel like, hey, I've learned a whole bunch from my teachers in high school, and I feel like I'm going back in time into a time warp, and they're not addressing these issues. So you may get students like that from time to time. I think that's kind of like, what happens to this tradition? Is it a viable tradition, or is it more like an antiquarian attempt to revive the past? That question sort of will have to be answered over time.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Maggie Miller in conversation with John Morawski of Real Clear Investigations. You can hear and see more of Maggie's interviews on RealClearInvestigations.com and on the RCP YouTube channel. I'm Andrew Walworth. That's our program for today. On behalf of Carl, Tom, and everyone here at Real Clear Politics, thank you for tuning in. Join us again next Monday. Have a great weekend.